The massive Galactic Council building stretched across 3 city blocks, its crystal walls humming with the energy of 1,000 different alien technologies. Inside the main chamber, things were not going well. Ambassador Veltar's 8 tentacles twitched nervously as he spread the latest disaster reports across the holographic display table. Zerion 7 had claimed another victim. The 4th victim, to be precise. The Zephyrians had been so confident when they launched their colonization mission 2 years ago. Their advanced atmospheric processes could handle any environment, they claimed. Their biosuits could protect them from the harshest conditions in known space. They lasted exactly 72 hours before their entire respiratory systems shut down from the toxic air. The rescue ships found their bodies crystallized in their own failed breathing apparatus. The 4th had learned from the Zephyrian mistakes. These silicon-based beings were naturally resistant to most chemical hazards. Their crystalline bodies could withstand temperatures that would melt steel. They built massive protective domes and brought enough supplies to last 5 years. The acid storms ate through their structures in 14 days. Not even their bones remained when the recovery team arrived. The Kethmori lasted almost a month. These energy beings thought they could simply avoid physical contact with the planet's surface entirely. They were wrong. Something in Zerion 7's electromagnetic field disrupted their very essence, scattered their consciousness across the planet's magnetic poles. Their screams still echoed in the Council's emergency recordings. The Thorian Empire, with all their military might and technological superiority, managed 6 weeks. 6 weeks of constant struggle against a world that seemed personally offended by their presence. Gravity storms crushed their vehicles. Temperature swings froze and boiled their equipment in the same day. Even their legendary Thorian stubbornness couldn't overcome what the planet threw at them. Now the Council sat in uncomfortable silence, each member avoiding eye contact with the others. Every major spacefaring civilization had been asked to volunteer for the Zerion 7 mission. Every single one had declined after reviewing the casualty reports. Everyone except the humans. Humans were relatively new to galactic politics. They'd only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, and had spent most of that time exploring and asking questions that made other species uncomfortable. Questions like, "Why haven't you tried this approach, and what if we did it differently?" The kind of questions that suggested these newcomers didn't understand how things worked in civilized space, but they were also known for taking jobs that other species considered too dangerous or too stupid to attempt. Human mercenaries fought in wars where the odds were impossible. Human traders went to planets where the profit margins barely covered funeral costs. Human scientists studied phenomena that had killed researchers from a dozen other species. Ambassador Veltar's personal opinion was that humans were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and he honestly couldn't tell which, maybe both. Their home planet Earth was classified as a Class II Deathworld, which explained a lot about their psychology. Any species that evolved dodging meteors, ice ages, supervolcanoes, and carnivorous megafauna was bound to have an unusual relationship with danger. When the Council's messenger drone arrived at the human space station orbiting Mars, Captain Hyunwoo was in the middle of reviewing applications for his next mission. The 34-year-old space veteran had earned his reputation handling first contact situations that went sideways. His calm demeanor and quick thinking had saved diplomatic relations with at least 6 species who might otherwise have declared war on humanity. His team was equally experienced in impossible situations. Dr. So Young had spent the last 5 years studying alien ecosystems that most biologists considered too dangerous to approach. Her research on carnivorous plant networks had revolutionized botanical science and earned her 3 major galactic research awards. Jin Ho was the kind of engineer who looked at impossible technical challenges and started sketching solutions. His innovations in adaptive construction had helped establish human colonies on 12 different worlds. Min Ho was a geologist who specialized in unstable planetary systems, the kind of worlds where the ground literally shifted under your feet. When Hyunwoo read the mission briefing, his first reaction wasn't fear or hesitation, it was curiosity. 4 different species had failed on Zerion 7, But each failure had provided valuable data. The Zephyrians had identified atmospheric hazards, the Vorth had mapped the acid storm patterns, the Kethmori had documented the electromagnetic anomalies. The Thorians had created detailed geological surveys before their demise. So Young looked up from her datapad, her dark eyes bright with scientific interest rather than concern. The environmental readings were certainly extreme, but Earth's history had prepared humans for extreme conditions. Ice ages had taught their ancestors about temperature survival. Volcanic regions had shown them how to work with hostile chemistry. Earthquake zones had demonstrated the importance of flexible construction. Jinho was already sketching preliminary shelter designs that could adapt to changing conditions rather than fighting them. His engineering philosophy had always been about working with natural forces instead of against them. Zerion 7 might be hostile, but hostility often followed patterns that could be predicted and managed. Minho was studying the geological data with professional fascination. Unstable didn't necessarily mean unpredictable. Every planet had rhythms, cycles that governed its behavior. Finding those patterns was just a matter of careful observation and patient analysis. The four humans exchanged glances around the briefing table. They all understood what the Galactic Council expected. Another failure, another species to add to Zerion 7's casualty list, another confirmation that some worlds were simply too dangerous for civilization. That expectation didn't intimidate them. If anything, it motivated them. The transport ship's landing system screamed warnings as they descended through Zerion 7's atmosphere. Red alerts flashed across every screen, and the automated voice kept repeating the same message in a dozen different languages. Hostile environment detected. Recommend immediate evacuation protocols. Yunwu ignored the warnings and focused on keeping the ship steady as acid rain hammered against their hull. The droplets weren't just water with a little bite to them. This was concentrated sulfuric acid that could eat through metal plating in minutes. Through the viewport, he could see the yellowish clouds swirling around them like angry ghosts. The moment they touched down, the real welcome party began. The temperature gauge showed 43 degrees Celsius. By the time Jin Ho had finished running his first equipment check, it had dropped to 3 degrees. The gravity meter couldn't seem to make up its mind, jumping between 0.8 and 1.4 Earth standard every few minutes. From orbit, the Galactic Council observers watched through their telescopes and started placing bets on how long the humans would last. The Zephyrian representative gave them 6 hours. The Vorth delegate was more generous with 12 hours. The Thorian ambassador just shook his head and muttered something about foolish mammals. But down on the surface, something unexpected was happening. Instead of panicking or calling for emergency evacuation, the human team was getting to work. Jinho pulled on his protective gear and stepped outside into the acid rain. The droplets hissed and steamed when they hit his suit, but the protective coating held. He knelt down and collected samples of the local soil, watching how it reacted to the acid. After running quick field tests, he discovered something interesting. The local minerals contained natural buffering agents that could neutralize the acid's worst effects. Within 3 hours, he had rigged up a basic filtration system using nothing but equipment from their landing pod and materials he'd scraped off the ground. The acid rain went in one end and relatively harmless water came out the other. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep their equipment from dissolving. Minho was having her own breakthrough with the gravity problem. She'd set up seismic monitoring equipment and was tracking the planet's gravitational shifts. What looked like random chaos to other species was actually following a pattern. The gravity changes matched underground seismic activity. When certain geological formations shifted deep beneath the surface, the gravitational field fluctuated in predictable ways. She mapped out the timing and discovered they had roughly 15-minute cycles. For 10 minutes, gravity would stay relatively stable. Then it would spike or drop for about 3 minutes before settling into a new pattern. It was like the planet was breathing, and once you learned its rhythm, you could work with it instead of fighting it. The temperature swings followed a similar pattern. The planet's core was incredibly active, sending waves of heat toward the surface in regular intervals. When Minho combined her gravitational data with thermal readings, She could predict temperature changes up to an hour in advance. But So-Young made the most surprising discovery of all. While her teammates were solving engineering problems, she was studying the planet's biology. According to every scientific model, Zerion 7 should have been completely sterile. The combination of acid, temperature extremes, and gravitational stress should have made life impossible. She was wrong. Life wasn't just possible on Zerion 7, it was thriving. Under her microscope, she found organisms that seemed to treat sulfuric acid like a nutritious snack. Tiny creatures that used gravitational changes to move around, riding the waves like cosmic surfers. Microbes that could instantly adapt their cellular structure to temperature changes that would kill most Earth organisms in seconds. These weren't just survivors. They were specialists, perfectly adapted to conditions that other species considered hellish. The acid rain that dissolved alien technology was providing essential nutrients for Zerion's ecosystem. The gravity fluctuations that crushed spacecraft were helping distribute spores and seeds across the landscape. The temperature swings that shattered crystalline structures were powering chemical reactions that sustained entire food chains. So-Young realized that previous colonization attempts had failed because they'd tried to fight the planet's natural systems. The Zephyrians had seen acid rain and built barriers against it. The Vorth had experienced gravity fluctuations and constructed rigid structures to resist them. The Kethamori had encountered electromagnetic interference and tried to shield themselves from it. But what if, instead of fighting these forces, you learned to work with them? What if the secret wasn't to make Zerion 7 more like other planets, but to make yourself more like Zerion 7? By the end of their first day, the humans had established a basic camp that was not only surviving, but actually using the planet's hostile environment to their advantage. Jinho's acid processing system was providing clean water. Minho's gravitational predictions were helping them schedule heavy construction work during stable periods. So-Young's biological discoveries were pointing toward possibilities that nobody had ever imagined. Up in orbit, the Galactic Council observers were running out of explanations for what they were seeing. The humans should have been dead by now. Instead, they were building something that looked suspiciously like a permanent settlement. The morning sun cast strange shadows across what had become the most unusual settlement in known galactic history. Where other species had built fortresses designed to keep Zerion 7 out, the humans had created something that seemed to breathe with the planet itself. Jinho stood back and admired his latest creation, wiping sweat from his forehead as another gravity wave rippled through the area. The building in front of him swayed gently, its walls bending like bamboo in a strong wind. When the gravitational stress passed, the structure settled back into its original shape without so much as a crack in the foundation. The secret had come to him during his second week on the planet, after watching how the native microorganisms responded to environmental changes. They didn't resist the forces around them. They flowed with them, adapted to them, used them. So Jinho had started designing buildings the same way. His structures used flexible joints and materials that could expand and contract without breaking. When gravity increased, the buildings compressed slightly and distributed the weight across their entire framework. When gravity decreased, they expanded back to their normal size. The walls were made from a composite of earth materials and local minerals that actually grew stronger under stress. The most impressive part was how the buildings looked. Instead of the harsh geometric shapes that most spacefaring species preferred, Jinho's designs curved and flowed like living things. They had rounded edges and surfaces that seemed to shift color depending on the light. Visitors from other worlds often mistook them for some kind of alien organism rather than constructed shelters. Each building served multiple purposes. The walls collected acid rain and processed it into clean water. The flexible foundation systems absorbed seismic energy and converted it into electrical power. The curved roofs channeled wind patterns to provide natural air conditioning. What looked like artistic design choices were actually sophisticated engineering solutions. So-Young's contributions were equally revolutionary. Her greenhouse domes dotted the settlement like giant soap bubbles, each one containing a carefully balanced ecosystem that seemed impossible by conventional standards. Inside these protective environments, Earth plants grew alongside Xerion native species, in combinations that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. She'd discovered that many of Xerion's native plants had extraordinary properties. Some could neutralize acid in the soil around them, creating safe zones where other vegetation could take root. Others produced natural compounds that helped regulate temperature, keeping their immediate environment stable even when the planet's weather went crazy. A few species actually thrived on the electromagnetic fluctuations that had destroyed previous colonization attempts. So Young had started crossbreeding these native plants with food crops from Earth. The results were remarkable. Tomatoes that could survive acid rain and actually use the sulfur compounds as nutrients to enhance their flavor. Wheat that grew stronger during gravity fluctuations, using the stress to develop denser grain heads. Rice that could adapt its growing cycle to match the planet's unpredictable temperature swings. Her greenhouses weren't just producing food, they were creating entirely new agricultural possibilities. Each dome was an experiment in what could happen when Earth biology met Xerion conditions. Some experiments failed spectacularly, but the successes were opening up possibilities that could revolutionize farming throughout the galaxy. Minho had become the settlement's unofficial prophet of planetary behavior. Her geological surveys had revealed that Xerion 7 wasn't chaotic at all. It was incredibly complex, but complexity wasn't the same thing as randomness. The planet had patterns within patterns, cycles that operated on different timescales, but all influenced each other. She'd mapped out the major geological zones and identified areas where the various environmental factors created relatively stable conditions. These became the sites for permanent infrastructure. She'd also found zones where the environmental stress was so intense that they could be used for testing equipment and materials under extreme conditions. Her prediction models had become so accurate that the team could schedule their activities around the planet's moods. Heavy construction work happened during gravitational calm periods. Delicate scientific experiments were timed to avoid electromagnetic storms. Agricultural work was coordinated with temperature stability zones. But Minho's most important discovery was that Xerion 7's extreme conditions weren't actually extreme by the planet's standards. They were normal. The problem was that other species had been trying to impose their own definition of normal on a world that operated by completely different rules. The settlement now housed 15 humans working in various specialties, and more were arriving each month. What had started as a desperate survival mission was becoming a thriving research station and agricultural center. The buildings grew organically as new arrivals brought fresh ideas and expertise. Supply ships from Earth arrived monthly, but they weren't bringing emergency rations and survival equipment anymore. They were bringing researchers, engineers, and settlers who wanted to be part of something unprecedented. Xerion 7 was becoming humanity's first successful Class 0 world colonization, and the implications were staggering. Other species had tried to conquer Xerion 7 through superior technology and brute force. They'd built walls to keep the planet out, created isolated environments that mimicked their homeworlds, and fought against every natural system they encountered. Every single approach had failed because they were fundamentally trying to make Xerion 7 into something it wasn't. The humans had taken the opposite approach. Instead of changing the planet to suit their needs, they were changing themselves to suit the planet's nature. They were learning Xerion 7's language instead of trying to teach it theirs. And in doing so, they were discovering that what everyone else had seen as hostile opposition was actually an invitation to dance. Yunwu watched his team work with quiet satisfaction. They weren't conquering this world, they were joining it. The seismic readings made no sense at first. Minho stared at her instruments for the third time that morning, convinced there had to be some kind of equipment malfunction. Natural geological formations didn't create patterns this regular, this deliberately structured. The underground spaces she was detecting weren't random caves carved by water or volcanic activity. They were too organized, too purposeful. She called Yunwu over to look at the data. The readouts showed a vast network of chambers and tunnels extending deep into Xerion 7's crust, following the planet's most geologically stable zones. The construction was incredibly sophisticated, designed to work with the planet's natural stress patterns rather than fighting them. Whoever had built this understood Xerion 7's geology better than any surface-dwelling species ever could. The implications hit them both at the same time. Xerion 7 wasn't uninhabited. It never had been. Someone had been living here all along, watching as 4 different species tried and failed to establish surface colonies. The question was, who were they and why hadn't they made contact? Yunwu decided on a direct approach. If there were intelligent beings living beneath their settlement, the polite thing to do was introduce themselves. The problem was figuring out how to communicate with someone who lived several kilometers underground and might not even know surface dwellers existed. Minho suggested using controlled seismic pulses to create patterns that might be recognized as artificial. She programmed her equipment to tap out simple mathematical sequences against the bedrock. Prime numbers, basic geometric ratios, anything that would clearly indicate intelligence rather than random geological activity. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th day, the mountain answered back. The response came as a series of precisely timed seismic vibrations that formed complex mathematical patterns. Not just simple number sequences, but sophisticated equations that demonstrated advanced understanding of physics and engineering. Whoever was down there wasn't just intelligent. They were highly educated and technologically advanced. The communication breakthrough came when So-Young suggested using mineral arrangements instead of just seismic signals. She'd noticed that the native plants seemed to respond to specific chemical compositions in the soil. If the underground dwellers were interacting with the planet's ecosystem, they might understand mineral-based communication. She arranged different types of local stones in mathematical patterns near the strongest seismic response points. Within hours, the arrangements had been subtly altered, not destroyed or scattered, but carefully rearranged to show different mathematical relationships. It was like having a conversation using rocks as words. The first real exchange took place a week later. The underground dwellers had arranged a complex mineral pattern that So-Young recognized as a molecular diagram. They were showing her the chemical structure of one of Xerion's native plants, but with slight modifications that would make it even more resistant to acid rain. So-Young responded by creating her own mineral arrangement, showing how earth plants could be crossbred with Xerion species. The underground dwellers replied with suggestions for improving the hybrid combinations. Within days, they were having detailed scientific discussions using nothing but carefully arranged stones. The breakthrough, in actual face-to-face contact, came when Jinho offered to demonstrate his building techniques. He used mineral arrangements to show how his flexible construction methods worked with Xerion's gravitational fluctuations instead of fighting them. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The underground dwellers wanted to see these techniques in action. A section of ground near the settlement's edge began to move. Not collapse or crack, but move deliberately as if the earth itself was reshaping. A tunnel entrance appeared, perfectly formed and reinforced with materials that seemed to be part organic, part mineral, and part something else entirely. The sea. First keeper to emerge was unlike anything in the galactic databases. Sorthak stood nearly 3 meters tall, with a body that seemed to be made of living crystal and metal. His movements were fluid and graceful, adapted to Xerion's variable gravity. When he spoke, it was through harmonic vibrations that resonated through the ground and could be felt as much as heard. The Keepers, as they called themselves, had been living on Xerion 7 for thousands of years. They'd evolved alongside the planets, extreme conditions, developing technology and culture that embraced environmental chaos rather than fighting it. Their civilization was built into the planet's most stable geological zones, connected by a vast network of tunnels that followed natural stress patterns. Sorthak explained that they'd watched previous colonization attempts with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. The Zephyrians, Vorth, Kethmori, and Thorians had all tried to impose their own environmental preferences on a world that had its own rules. The Keepers had considered making contact, but every previous species had shown aggressive tendencies toward environmental modification that worried the underground dwellers. The humans were different. Instead of trying to terraform Xerion 7, They were adapting themselves to work with the planet's natural systems. Instead of building walls against the acid rain, they were using it as a resource. Instead of fighting gravity fluctuations, they were designing structures that moved with them. When So Young shared her greenhouse techniques and showed how Earth plants could actually benefit from Zerion's harsh conditions, Sorthak was fascinated. The Keepers had developed their own agricultural methods over the millennia, but they'd never considered biological combinations between different worlds. Jin Ho's flexible construction methods impressed the Keepers even more. Their own building techniques were incredibly sophisticated, but they were based on working with solid stone and metal. Jin Ho's approach of creating structures that could flex and adapt opened up new possibilities they'd never considered. The first cultural exchange happened when Sorthak invited a small group of humans into the Keeper city. The underground settlement was breathtaking, with crystal formations that provided light and organic curves that followed the planet's natural geological flows. The Keepers had created a civilization that was truly part of Zerion 7 rather than imposed on it. What amazed the humans most was how the Keepers had turned every challenge of their harsh world into an advantage. They used gravitational fluctuations to power their machinery. They channeled acid rain into chemical processing systems. They'd built their entire society around the principle that Zerion 7's extreme conditions weren't obstacles to overcome, but resources to utilize. For the Keepers, meeting the humans was equally revolutionary. For the first time, they'd encountered surface dwellers who understood their fundamental philosophy about living with planetary forces rather than against them. The possibility of combining Keeper geological knowledge with human adaptability opened up opportunities neither species had imagined alone. The inspection ship approached Zerion 7 with all the enthusiasm of a medical examiner arriving at a crime scene. Ambassador Veltar had prepared himself for the grim task of documenting another failed colonization attempt and arranging for the removal of human remains. The Galactic Council had sent him with a full disaster response team, including grief, counselors and hazardous waste specialists. What they found instead defied every prediction, statistical model and scientific theory they'd brought with them. From orbit, Zerion 7 looked like a completely different planet than the one documented in previous reports. Where satellite images had once shown nothing but barren wasteland and chemical storms, now there were clear signs of organized activity. Geometric patterns marked agricultural zones. Structural formations indicated permanent buildings. Energy signatures suggested active technology and power generation. Most shocking of all, there were two distinct types of settlements. The human. Structures on the surface were obvious enough, but the orbital scans also detected massive underground facilities that hadn't appeared in any previous surveys. Somebody else was living on this supposedly uninhabitable Deathworld, and they'd been there for a very long time. Ambassador Veltar's first transmission to the surface was cautious and formal. He expected to reach emergency survivors, or perhaps automated distress beacons. Instead, Hyunwoo's voice came through clearly, sounding relaxed and welcoming. He invited the inspection team down for what he called the full tour, as if Zerion 7 was some kind of tourist destination rather than a Class 0 Deathworld. The landing was the first surprise. Previous expeditions had reported that Zerion 7's surface conditions made controlled landings nearly impossible. Gravity fluctuations threw off navigation systems, acid storms corroded landing gear, temperature extremes warped hull materials. The inspection team's pilot prepared for an emergency crash landing at best. Instead, they touched down on a perfectly maintained landing pad with guidance systems that compensated for every environmental variable. Ground crews were waiting to help with their equipment, wearing protective gear that looked more like comfortable work clothes than emergency survival suits. The humans were operating in conditions that should have killed them, and they were doing it casually. Veltar stepped off the ship into an acid rainstorm and immediately began checking his environmental suit's integrity warnings. The protective systems were screaming alerts about atmospheric toxicity and chemical burns. But the humans around him were walking through the same acid rain with nothing more than light jackets and face shields. Hyunwoo met them at the landing pad with a smile. That suggested he was genuinely happy to have visitors. He looked healthy, relaxed and completely at ease in an environment that was actively trying to kill everyone around him. When Veltar commented on the harsh conditions, Hyunwoo just shrugged and said it was a pretty mild day by Zerion standards. The tour began with Jinho's architectural innovations. The Galactic Council team had studied the building techniques used by all 4 failed colonization attempts. Each species had constructed rigid, heavily fortified structures designed to keep Zerion 7's environmental hazards outside. These human buildings looked like they were made of liquid metal and organic curves rather than solid construction materials. Veltar was examining one of the residential buildings when a gravity fluctuation hit. The ambassador and his team immediately grabbed for support rails and emergency stabilizers as their inner ears struggled to cope with the sudden change in gravitational force. The human building around them simply swayed gently, like a tree bending in the wind, then settled back to its original shape without any apparent stress or damage. Jinho explained his flexible construction philosophy while the building demonstrated it in real time. Instead of fighting against Zerion's gravitational chaos, his structures moved with it. Instead of resisting environmental forces, they absorbed and redirected them. The buildings weren't just surviving Zerion 7's hostility. They were using that hostility as a source of power and structural stability. So Young's agricultural demonstrations were even more impressive. She led the inspection team through greenhouse domes, where plants from Earth were growing alongside Zerion native species in combinations that violated every rule of xenobiology. Tomatoes thrived in soil that should have dissolved their roots. Wheat grew stronger during acid rainstorms. Rice adapted its growing cycle to match gravitational fluctuations. The Vorth representative was particularly skeptical. His species had attempted to establish atmospheric processes that could create safe growing conditions for imported food crops. The processes had lasted 2 weeks before Zerion's chemical storms overwhelmed their filtration systems. Yet here were Earth plants not just surviving, but actually benefiting from the same chemical conditions that had destroyed Vorth technology. So Young showed them her hybrid crops, explaining how she'd crossbred Earth species with Zerion natives to create plants that treated environmental stress as nutrition. The acid that corroded alien equipment was providing essential minerals for her vegetables. The electromagnetic fluctuations that disrupted communication systems were helping her plants coordinate their growth patterns. But the biggest shock came when Minho introduced them to the keepers. The inspection team had come expecting to document human failure. Instead, they discovered that humans had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history: successful first contact and cooperation with a previously unknown intelligent species on a Class 0 Deathworld. Sorthak emerged from the underground tunnel system like something from a geological fairy tale, the crystalline being moved with fluid grace through conditions that made the inspection team's environmental suits work overtime just to keep their wearers alive. When he spoke, his harmonic vibrations resonated through the ground in patterns that the humans had learned to understand as language. The Keeper Elder explained that his people had been watching galactic colonization attempts for decades. Every previous species had tried to impose their environmental preferences on Zerion 7 through superior technology and brute force. Every attempt had failed because they were fundamentally fighting against the planet's nature rather than working with it. The humans were the first surface dwellers to understand what the Keepers had learned over thousands of years of evolution. Zerion 7 wasn't hostile, it was selective. The planet's extreme conditions weren't obstacles to overcome, but resources to utilize. The acid rain, gravity fluctuations, and temperature swings weren't environmental hazards, but integral parts of a complex ecosystem that could support incredible diversity if you learned to work with its rhythms. As the inspection team watched, humans and keepers collaborating on projects that combined surface and underground technologies, Veltar realized he would need to completely rewrite his report. This wasn't a failed colonization attempt that needed cleanup. This was the beginning of something that could change how the galaxy approached planetary settlement forever. The humans hadn't conquered Zerion 7. They'd joined it, and in doing so, they'd proven that the impossible was just another word for untried. Dr. Kithara had studied alien species for over 3 decades, but the humans on Zerion 7 were unlike anything in her extensive research files. The tall, mantis-like scientist spent weeks observing the human settlement, taking detailed notes on behaviors that seemed to contradict everything the Galactic Council thought they knew about survival psychology. Most species, when faced with environmental stress, responded with either fight or flight reactions. They either tried to dominate their surroundings through superior technology, or they retreated to safer locations. The humans were doing something completely different. They were treating Zerion 7's deadly challenges like a fascinating puzzle that needed solving. Kithara watched Jin-Ho work on a new building design while acid rain pelted his protective gear. Any rational being would have waited for better weather conditions. Instead, the human engineer was using the storm as a testing opportunity, observing how different materials responded to the chemical assault and making real-time adjustments to his construction techniques. When she asked him why he didn't just wait for safer conditions, Jin-Ho looked at her with genuine confusion. "But then I wouldn't learn how the building performs in actual storm conditions," he explained. "The acid rain is giving me valuable data about material stress patterns. This is the perfect time to test my designs." This attitude was completely alien to most galactic species. The Vorth had spent months in laboratory conditions, testing their construction materials under controlled circumstances before attempting to build on Zerion 7. Their perfectly engineered structures had failed within weeks because laboratory conditions couldn't replicate the planet's chaotic reality. But humans seemed to prefer learning through direct experience, even when that experience was dangerous. They called it learning by doing, and they applied this philosophy to everything, from engineering to agriculture to interspecies diplomacy. Kithara's biological analysis revealed something equally fascinating about human evolution. Earth's environmental history read like a catalogue of planetary disasters that should have caused mass extinctions, ice ages that lasted tens of thousands of years, volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for months, asteroid impacts that wiped out dominant species, climate shifts that happened over decades rather than millennia. Most species evolved on worlds with relatively stable conditions. Their homeworlds might have seasonal variations or occasional natural disasters, but nothing approaching Earth's environmental chaos. Humans had evolved under conditions where adaptability wasn't just useful, it was absolutely essential for survival. Their ancestors had survived ice ages by learning to use fire and create shelter. They'd endured volcanic winters by developing food storage and preservation techniques. They'd adapted to climate changes by developing agriculture and animal domestication. Every major environmental crisis in Earth's history had forced human ancestors to innovate or die. This evolutionary background had created some unusual psychological traits. Where other species saw environmental challenges as threats to be avoided, humans saw them as problems to be solved. Where other species preferred predictable conditions, humans seemed to thrive on variety and change. But the most remarkable human trait was their approach to cooperation. Most galactic species formed alliances based on shared genetics, similar environmental needs, or mutual defense against common threats. Human cooperation was far more flexible and creative. Kithara observed, So Young working with Sorthak on agricultural experiments that combined Earth biology with Keeper geological techniques. The two beings couldn't have been more different. So Young was carbon-based, warm-blooded, and adapted for surface conditions. Sorthak was silicon-based, operated at much lower temperatures, and had evolved for underground environments. Yet they worked together as if they'd been research partners for years. They communicated through a mixture of mineral arrangements, mathematical patterns, and harmonic vibrations that neither species had used before meeting each other. They'd created their own hybrid language for sharing scientific concepts that didn't exist in either of their original cultures. The agricultural results of their partnership were extraordinary. Earth plants modified with Keeper techniques could now thrive in conditions that would have killed unmodified crops within hours. Zerion native species enhanced with Earth biological principles were producing yields that amazed even the keepers, who'd been practicing sustainable agriculture for millennia. This kind of cross-species cooperation was practically unknown in galactic civilization. Most species formed trade relationships or military alliances, but actual collaborative innovation between completely different forms of life was almost unheard of. Kethara's psychological profiles revealed another unusual human trait. They seemed to become more creative and motivated when facing difficult challenges. Most species performed their best work under optimal conditions with minimal stress. Humans appeared to do their most innovative thinking when everything was going wrong. She watched Minho respond to a major seismic event that disrupted her geological monitoring equipment. Instead of treating it as a setback, the human geologist immediately began developing new measurement techniques that could work during active seismic activity. Within days, she'd invented monitoring systems that were actually more accurate than her original equipment. This pattern repeated throughout the settlement. Equipment failures led to improved designs. Resource shortages sparked innovation in local material usage. Communication problems with the keepers resulted in new forms of interspecies language. Every obstacle became an opportunity for advancement. The humans also demonstrated remarkable cultural flexibility. The settlement included people from a dozen different Earth nations with varying languages, religions, and social customs. Yet they worked together with minimal conflict, adapting their cultural practices to fit their new environment and circumstances. Kethara realized that human success on Zerion 7 wasn't just about their individual capabilities. It was about their approach to challenge and change. They didn't just adapt to new conditions. They actively sought out ways to turn those conditions into advantages. Other species had tried to make Zerion 7 more like their homeworlds. Humans had learned to make themselves more like Zerion 7, and in doing so, they discovered possibilities that nobody else had imagined. The secret wasn't superior technology or biological advantages. It was a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty, challenge, and change. Humans didn't just survive difficult conditions, they used them as stepping stones to something better. The transformation of Zerion 7 from Deathworld to thriving hub happened faster than anyone had thought possible. What started as a desperate last resort mission had become the most successful planetary colonization project in recent galactic history, and word was spreading throughout civilized space. The official designation ceremony took place exactly 1 year after the first human landing. Representatives from dozens of galactic civilizations gathered in orbit around Zerion 7 to witness something unprecedented. A Class 0 Deathworld being reclassified as a successful colony world. The ceremony itself was historic, but what really impressed the delegates was the planet's surface activity visible from their ships. Where orbital scans had once shown nothing but hostile wasteland, now there were clear signs of a bustling civilization. Landing pads accommodated regular transport traffic. Agricultural zones stretched across former chemical waste areas. Underground tunnel networks connected surface settlements with keeper city-states deep beneath the planet's crust. The Deathworld had become a marketplace. The population growth was remarkable. The original 4-person human team had grown to over 300 residents representing 12 different Earth nations. But the real success story was integration with the Keepers. 6 different Keeper clans had moved closer to the surface to participate in joint projects, creating the first truly integrated interspecies society most galactic observers had ever seen. Cultural exchange between humans and Keepers was producing innovations neither species could have achieved alone. Human flexibility combined with Keeper patience created research projects that operated on multiple timescales simultaneously. Short-term human experiments provided rapid data collection, while long-term Keeper observations tracked changes across geological time periods. The architectural revolution began when other planets started requesting Jin Ho's building designs. His flexible construction techniques, originally developed for Zerion 7's chaotic conditions, turned out to be incredibly useful on any world with environmental challenges. Planets with seismic activity, atmospheric instability, or extreme weather patterns all benefited from structures that could adapt rather than simply resist environmental forces. A mining colony on Kaveth 9 had been struggling with buildings that collapsed during the planet's frequent earthquakes. Jinho's adaptive construction techniques allowed them to build structures that actually became more stable during seismic events, using the ground movement to strengthen their foundations. What had been a failing operation became a profitable mining venture within 6 months. Agricultural worlds throughout the sector were implementing So-Young's crossbreeding techniques. Her method of combining native species with imported crops was revolutionizing food production on planets that had previously required expensive terraforming or constant resource imports from other worlds. The desert planet Aridus 4 had been dependent on food shipments for over a century because nothing would grow in their mineral-poor soil. So-Young's hybrid techniques created crops that could extract nutrients from sand and actually improved soil quality as they grew. Within a growing season, Aridus 4 was not only feeding itself, but exporting food to neighboring systems. Minho's geological analysis work was in demand across dozens of worlds. Her ability to find patterns in seemingly chaotic planetary systems was helping other colonies understand and work with their environments, rather than fighting against them. Her consultation work had identified 17 worlds previously written off as uninhabitable that actually showed potential for specialized colonization approaches. The planet Thermos 6 had been abandoned after temperature extremes destroyed 3 separate colonization attempts. Minho's analysis revealed that the temperature swings followed predictable solar and geological patterns. With proper timing and adaptive technology, the planet's temperature extremes could actually be used as an energy source. A new colonization mission was already in planning stages. Trade relationships were perhaps the most significant development. Zerion 7 was exporting technologies and techniques that couldn't be developed anywhere else. The planet's extreme conditions made it a perfect testing ground for equipment and materials that needed to perform under stress. Other worlds were paying premium prices for tools and construction materials that had been proven under Zerion conditions. The Keeper contribution to this trade economy was equally valuable. Their deep understanding of geological processes and mineral extraction was helping mining operations throughout the sector become more efficient and environmentally sustainable. Keeper engineering principles were being adapted for use in asteroid mining, deep core drilling, and resource extraction on high-gravity worlds. But the most requested export was consultation services. The Human-Keeper partnership approach to environmental challenges was being studied and adapted throughout the galaxy. Worlds that had been struggling with terraforming projects for decades were achieving success within months by switching to adaptation-based approaches rather than environmental domination strategies. The Galactic Council's attitude toward humanity had undergone a complete reversal. Species that had previously seen humans as reckless newcomers were now requesting human involvement in their most challenging projects. The Council was offering premium compensation for human consultation on difficult worlds, environmental restoration projects, and interspecies cooperation initiatives. Ambassador Veltar found himself defending budget allocations for human-led projects that his colleagues had considered impossible just 2 years earlier. The same adaptability and environmental chaos tolerance that had made other species view humans as unstable wildcards was now seen as their greatest asset. Zerion 7 had become proof of concept for an entirely new approach to galactic colonization. Instead of making planets more suitable for existing species, the focus was shifting toward helping species become more suitable for challenging planets. The galaxy was full of worlds with valuable resources that had been written off as uninhabitable. Human-Keeper techniques were opening up colonization possibilities that could reshape interstellar civilization. The Deathworld had become a beacon of possibility, showing that cooperation, adaptation, and creative problem-solving could turn the galaxy's greatest challenges into its greatest opportunities. The view from the orbital station's observation deck never failed to amaze visitors. Below them, Zerion 7 spun slowly against the starfield, its surface glowing with the lights of dozens of settlements. What had once been considered the most hostile planet in this sector of the galaxy was now one of the busiest, with spacecraft, arriving and departing every few hours, carrying researchers, traders, and students from across known space. Hyunwoo pressed his hand against the transparent aluminum viewing port and smiled at the irony. 5 years ago, the Galactic Council had sent his team to Zerion 7, expecting them to fail spectacularly. Now he was the Director of Extreme Environment Operations for the most successful interspecies cooperation project in galactic history, overseeing operations that spanned multiple star systems. The orbital station itself was a testament to how much had changed. Built using hybrid human-keeper engineering principles, it could withstand the electromagnetic storms that regularly erupted from Zerion 7's active core. Traditional space station designs would have been destroyed or rendered inoperable within months. This station actually used the planet's electromagnetic activity to supplement its power systems. Traffic control was reporting another busy day. 3 research vessels from the Andorian Science Institute were requesting landing clearance to study So-Young's latest agricultural experiments. A trade convoy from the Centauri Commercial Alliance was delivering raw materials in exchange for Keeper-designed geological survey equipment. 2 diplomatic missions were arriving to negotiate consultation contracts for terraforming projects on their homeworlds. The transformation was visible everywhere. The planet's surface, once scarred by acid storms and geological chaos, now showed the organized patterns of a thriving civilization. Agricultural zones stretched across former wastelands, their hybrid crops turning hostile soil into productive farmland. Research facilities dotted the landscape, each one designed to take advantage of Zerion's extreme conditions for testing equipment and materials under stress. But the real success story was underground. The Keeper cities had expanded dramatically, with new tunnels and chambers connecting previously isolated clan territories. The underground civilization that had hidden from surface contact for millennia was now actively participating in galactic commerce and scientific exchange. So-Young's Department of Adaptive Biology had become the galaxy's leading research center for interspecies biological cooperation. Her team had documented over 3,000 successful symbiotic relationships between Earth organisms and alien life forms from dozens of different worlds. Universities throughout civilized space were sending their brightest students to study her crossbreeding techniques. The agricultural applications alone had revolutionized farming on challenging worlds throughout the sector. Planets that had struggled with food production for decades were now not only self-sufficient, but exporting surplus crops. The hybrid organisms So-Young's team developed could thrive in conditions that would kill traditional crops, turning marginal agricultural land into productive farming zones. Jinho's engineering corps had grown from a one-person operation to a training academy that attracted architects and engineers from across the galaxy. His flexible construction principles were being adapted for use on seismic worlds, planets with extreme weather patterns, and even in space-based construction projects where traditional rigid structures couldn't handle the stress of orbital mechanics. The waiting list for Jinho's training programs was over 2 years long. Entire engineering academies were restructuring their curricula to include adaptive construction techniques. The rigid, fortress-like building methods that had dominated galactic architecture for centuries were giving way to structures that could bend, flow, and adapt to their environments. Minho's geological survey had identified resource opportunities on 47 worlds that had previously been written off as economically unviable. Her ability to find patterns in planetary chaos was helping mining operations, colonization efforts, and scientific expeditions throughout known space. Several worlds that had been abandoned due to geological instability were being successfully recolonized using her prediction models. The Keepers had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Elder Sorthak now served as cultural ambassador to the Galactic Council, representing not just his own species, but the hybrid human-keeper civilization that had emerged on Zerion 7. Keeper technical advisors were working on projects throughout the sector, sharing geological expertise that had been developed over thousands of years of harsh world survival. The cultural exchange between humans and Keepers had created something unprecedented in galactic civilization. Two completely different species had not only learned to coexist, but had actually merged their capabilities to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The success was inspiring similar cooperation efforts on other worlds, where multiple species were attempting to establish joint colonies. Today's incoming transport carried a particularly interesting group of passengers, young scientists from 6 different species, all coming to study at what had become known as the Zarian Institute for Extreme Environment Studies. They represented the next generation of galactic researchers, trained in cooperation techniques and adaptive thinking that would help them tackle challenges their predecessors had considered impossible. Hyunwoo watched the transport navigate through one of Zarion's electromagnetic storms with the kind of casual efficiency that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The pilot was using storm patterns to enhance the ship's approach vector, turning environmental hazard into navigational advantage. As the transport touched down on the main landing platform, Hyunwoo reflected on how completely wrong all the initial predictions had been. The Galactic Council had expected Zarion 7 to be humanity's greatest failure, proof that some challenges were simply too extreme for any species to overcome. Instead, it had become proof that the word impossible was often just another way of saying nobody's tried the right approach yet. The planet that was supposed to destroy human ambition had instead become the foundation for a new way of thinking about environmental challenges, interspecies cooperation, and the untapped potential hidden in the galaxy's most hostile worlds. The Deathworld had taught them all how to live.